2 years ago, when I crossed the rusty gate of my new home, I felt something uncomfortable, like an inexplicable chill, even under the hot sun of that afternoon. It was the last house on a dead-end street in a suburban neighborhood, surrounded by tall trees that cast dense shadows at dusk. For many, it might have seemed cozy. For me, there was something strangely oppressive, like a scene from a horror movie. But I brushed it off because my daughter had loved everything about it. I was 27 years old, recently divorced, trying to start over with my 6-year-old daughter, Clara. Buying that house had been a tremendous effort, but it was finally a place to call our own. Clara was excited. "Mommy, can I paint my room lilac?" she asked, as she ran through the living room still full of boxes. I agreed with a smile, trying to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. On the first night, I noticed through the kitchen window a figure standing on the sidewalk. A man, perhaps in his 40s, wearing a worn leather jacket, was staring fixedly at our house. He wasn't doing anything, just observing. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to understand what was happening, until he turned his back and entered the house next door without saying a word. The following days were dedicated to organizing the house and adapting to my new job. Clara started at the local school and seemed to be adjusting well, but I still couldn't ignore the neighbor's behavior. He had a habit of being outside, standing on his porch, watching us whenever we left or arrived. Sometimes he waved with a strange smile, which looked more like a forced grimace. One Saturday morning, while cleaning the yard, I noticed the sound of tools coming from his house. I looked over the fence and saw him sharpening something in his garage, with methodical, almost ritualistic movements. When he noticed my presence, he looked up and smiled. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said, in a tone that made me shiver. I tried to be polite but brief. "Thank you. It's a quiet place, isn't it?" He laughed, a dry and unsettling sound. "Yes, very quiet, especially at night." After that, he went back to what he was doing, but now I noticed he was cutting something that looked like bones. I took a step back, but convinced myself it was my imagination. Maybe they were branches or something else. That night, Clara woke up crying. "Mommy, T here is someone in my room," she said, sobbing. My heart raced. I ran to her room and turned on the light. There was nothing there. I checked the closet, under the bed, even the locked window. "It was just a nightmare, my love," I said, trying to calm her down, but my stomach was churning. I decided to install security cameras in the yard and at the house entrances the next day. I didn't tell Clara, but the night before I had heard footsteps in the hallway. I attributed it to fatigue, but the feeling of being watched persisted. The camera recordings didn't show anything unusual until the third night. Reviewing the videos, I saw a movement in the yard. A shadow passed by the fence and moved slowly towards the living room window, where it stood for minutes, looking inside. My heart almost stopped. It was him. I locked the doors, closed the curtains. I didn't sleep that night. I decided to go to the police the next morning. I couldn't take it anymore. I took with me the security camera recordings and explained every detail. The neighbor, his strange obsession, the disturbing behaviors, and the shadow in the yard. The policeman who attended me, a middle-aged man with a weary look on his face, examined the images with disdain. "Look, ma'am, this could be anything. You can't say he was doing something illegal just because he was in your yard. Something of his might have fallen there. It could be a misunderstanding." He looked at me over his glasses, with a tone that seemed to suggest I was overreacting. "Reinforce your locks. Keep the cameras on. If something concrete happens, let us know." I left there feeling like I had lost a battle against an invisible threat. It wasn't paranoia. I knew. He was waiting for the right moment. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, checking each one at least 3 times. I pushed chairs against the doors and kept the sharpest knife from the kitchen on the bedside table. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence. The wind shook the branches outside, and the creaking of the trees made my heart race. At around 3:12 a.m., I was jolted from a restless sleep by the distinct sound of something dragging on the porch. It was slow, irregular, as if someone was pushing something heavy across the wooden floor. My body froze. I couldn't move, only listen. Then came the sound that made me hold my breath, the soft click of the back door handle trying to open. Once, then again, harder. Slowly, I slid out of bed, clutching the knife with trembling hands. I went to Clara's room, moving in absolute silence, fearing that any noise would betray my location. I locked the door behind me, sliding down to the floor with Clara still sleeping soundly in bed. My fingers could barely hold the phone as I dialed the police. Here is someone in my house," I whispered, my voice breaking as I tried not to cry. "Ma'am, stay calm. The police are on their way. Are you safe?" the operator asked, but how could I answer that? Outside the room, the footsteps grew firmer. I could hear them crossing the kitchen, echoing across the tiled floor. A dry, rhythmic sound of something heavy being dragged accompanied the footsteps, as if he was taking some object with him to the bedroom. I tried to muffle my breathing as the sound approached. He stopped in front of Clara's bedroom door. I could hear his heavy breathing, as if he was analyzing the situation, calculating his next moves. The silence that followed was even worse. And then, he simply left. Minutes dragged on like hours, until the intermittent lights of the police cruiser invaded the windows. I ran to open the door, shaking so much that I could barely turn the doorknob. When the police entered, the house seemed normal, as if I had imagined everything, until they looked at the kitchen. On the floor, near the back door, was a rag doll. It was small, with simple clothes and hand-painted eyes, large and wide. But what made me shiver was the precision of the details. The eyes were identical to Clara's. The police couldn't find anyone. They searched the neighborhood, but he had vanished. Still, they made it clear that I should leave. This wasn't just a scare. Someone was sending you a message, one of them said, looking at the doll. That night, Clara slept in my arms, and I didn't sleep a wink. We moved the next day. I couldn't spend another night in that house. I later found out that the man was a suspect in several disappearances in the area, but there was never enough evidence to convict him. Now, every night, I obsessively check locks and cameras, even in the small apartment we moved to. I have never been able to sleep deeply, always waiting to hear footsteps in the hallway. And the worst of all? Sometimes Clara asks me, "Mommy, where is that man who waved at me through the window?" When I arrived in Los Angeles, the house seemed like a distorted dream, almost too perfect to be real. Small, with a peeling white fence that begged for a new coat of paint and a wild garden, but with a charm that bordered on the macabre. It was as if time had become entangled in that place, exuding a suffocating nostalgia that reminded me of something I couldn't quite identify. Perhaps it was my mother, whose presence seemed to whisper in every corner. Everything there reminded me of her, but in a way that sent a chill down my spine. The neighborhood was silent, almost too much, and the neighbors seemed friendly, but something was wrong from the very first moment. A sense of unease settled in my chest, as if invisible eyes were watching me. On the first night, while I was in the kitchen trying to organize the dishes in the cupboard, I heard footsteps coming from the backyard. I looked out the window, but all I saw was the eerie sway of the branches in the wind. I thought it was my imagination or some nocturnal animal. However, the sound persisted, as if someone were pacing back and forth, relentlessly. I closed all the doors and windows, turned on the television to drown out the noise, but my body was on high alert, as if my skin was tingling with a silent and terrifying warning. The next day, I met the neighbor from the house next door. His name was Arthur, a man in his 50s, thin, with a stooped posture and a smile that never reached his eyes. He greeted me as I was taking out the trash. There was something in his eyes that deeply disturbed me, as if he were studying me, dissecting me. I tried to be polite, but the discomfort was palpable, almost tangible. He made a comment about how my mother would be proud to see me there, and that froze me. I hadn't mentioned anything about her. How did he know? The house next door was always dark, shrouded in perpetual shadows. No matter the time, the curtains were always closed, and I never saw anyone enter or leave, except for Arthur. I began to notice small, disturbing details. One day, I returned from the market and noticed that the door to my basement was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it. I descended the stairs with a flashlight in hand, feeling the smell of mold and dust invading my nose. Nothing seemed out of place, but when I came back upstairs, I saw a muddy footprint on the living room carpet. My heart began to race at an alarming rate. I started locking everything obsessively, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I began to hear things, a creak of wood in the dead of night, slow footsteps in the backyard, and one night, the sound of something scratching the exterior wall of my bedroom. My nights turned into a cycle of insomnia and paranoia. I saw my mother everywhere, but now, along with the longing, there was fear. It was as if her presence was trying to warn me of something terrible, of an imminent danger. Arthur continued to appear at the most inopportune moments, like a haunting specter. He would find me in the garden, always with strange questions. Have you been sleeping well? Old houses can make weird noises. You'll get used to it. His voice was low, drawn out, as if each word was carefully calculated to send shivers down my spine. I started avoiding him, but it seemed like he was always around, a constant shadow in my life. One night, I woke up to a loud crack, as if something had fallen. I grabbed my phone and, trembling, went to investigate. The back door was open, and the cold night air was invading the house, bringing with it a smell of decay. My stomach churned with terror. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and called the police, but my hands were shaking so much, I almost dropped the phone. While I waited, I heard heavy footsteps coming from upstairs. I nearly dropped the phone. I lived alone. I climbed the stairs with trembling legs, each step echoing in the terrifying silence. The hallway light flickered before going out completely, plunging me into darkness. I reached my bedroom, and the door was ajar. My heart felt like a drum in my chest, beating so hard I feared it might explode. I pushed the door open slowly, and there, in the dark, I felt I wasn't alone. The smell of sour sweat and something metallic invaded my nose, suffocating me. Then, I saw the silhouette. Arthur. He was standing in the corner of the room, holding something that gleamed under the faint light coming from the street. When he took a step toward me, I screamed and ran. I locked myself in the bathroom, hearing his footsteps approach, each one echoing like thunder in my mind. He knocked on the door calmly, as if he wanted to provoke me, to torture me. You shouldn't have come here, you know. It's not safe for you alone. His voice was a menacing whisper that echoed in the silence. The police arrived before he could break down the door. When they opened it, he was gone. They found only footprints and the knife he had dropped, a sinister warning of what could have happened. Arthur disappeared that night, leaving behind a trail of terror. The house next door was empty, covered in dust and full of photographs of me scattered on one of the walls, as if he had been watching me the whole time, studying me. Now, months later, I am in therapy trying to overcome what happened. I still live in the same house, although a part of me knows I should leave. Something inside me doesn't want to give it up, as if it were a last connection to my mother, a bond that keeps me tied to this place of nightmares. But every night, when I turn off the lights, I hear the noises, creaks, footsteps, and sometimes I smell the sour sweat again. I don't know if it's my mind playing tricks on me, or if he's still out there, waiting for the right moment to return to my nightmare, to drag me back into the terror from which I barely escaped. My name is Jennifer, and at 29 years old, I thought I was making the best decision of my life when I moved into a quaint little house in a seemingly peaceful suburban neighborhood of Tampa, Florida. After years of living in cramped, noisy apartments in the city, the promise of tranquility and solitude was intoxicating. It was my first time living alone, and the thought of having my own space, my own sanctuary, was exhilarating. The house was modest but charming, pristine white walls, a small garden, and a porch where I imagined myself sipping coffee on chilly mornings. But from the very first day, something felt off. It was the silence. During the day, the neighborhood was quiet, the calm broken only by the distant laughter of children or the occasional bark of a dog. But at night, the silence was suffocating, a heavy, oppressive blanket that seemed to smother every sound. I could hear every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind through the cracks in the windows, and even the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. It didn't take long for the unease to set in. On the day I moved in, I noticed a neighbor watching me from his window. He was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and a face that seemed perpetually twisted into a scowl. When our eyes met, he didn't look away. He just stared, his gaze boring into me as if he were trying to memorize every detail of my face. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered, a nagging discomfort that refused to leave. In the days that followed, the small, unsettling details began to pile up. The trash bin in front of my house was ransacked almost every night. I would leave it neat and tidy before bed. But in the morning, it was always overturned, with torn bags and food scraps strewn across the yard. I thought it might be raccoons, but when I mentioned it to the mailman, he mumbled something about the creatures around here and quickly averted his eyes, as if he knew more than he was letting on. Then came the sounds. At first, it was just the soft rustle of leaves in the garden, but soon I began to hear footsteps. They were light, almost as if someone were trying to sneak around. I peered out the window countless times, but I never saw anything. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or my imagination running wild, but one night the footsteps stopped right under my window. My heart hammered in my chest as I grabbed my phone to call the police, but before I could dial, the sound vanished. The next morning, I found large footprints in the dirt outside my window. They were unmistakably human. I started closing all the curtains at night, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. One day, I returned home to find a small wooden box on my porch. Inside was a handful of dirt and an old, filthy toy car, its paint peeling and rusted. The image of the neighbor staring at my house flashed through my mind. I left the box outside and hurried inside, my heart racing. The situation escalated on a stormy night. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard a scratching sound coming from the back door. I got up slowly, my legs feeling like lead, and made my way to the kitchen. Each step echoed in the oppressive silence. When I reached the door, I saw the shadow of someone through the frosted glass. I froze, my mind racing. The scratching stopped, but then came the knocks, 3 sharp, deliberate raps. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I grabbed a knife from the drawer and shouted, "Who's there?" No answer. 3 more knocks. I yelled that I was calling the police. Silence. Moments later, I heard footsteps running away through the wet grass. The relief was fleeting. The next morning, I found something carved into the door. "You don't belong here." My legs turned to jelly. I called the police, but they were dismissive, saying it was probably just a prank and promising to patrol the area more frequently, but I knew it wasn't a prank. That night, I barricaded myself inside, dragging furniture against the doors and windows, but the terror reached its peak a few nights later. I woke up to a muffled sound coming from the hallway. It was the sound of something breaking, a sharp crack that echoed through the silence. I grabbed my phone and saw it was 3 a.m. Fear paralyzed me for a moment, but then I forced myself to get up. I crept toward the sound, trying to be as quiet as possible. When I reached the hallway, I was hit with a strange smell, a mix of metal and wet earth. The sound continued, louder now. It was the lock on the front door being forced. My instinct was to run to my room and lock myself in. I called the police as I pushed the dresser against the door. From the other side of the house, I heard the door creak open. Heavy footsteps thudded on the wooden floor. I could barely speak, my voice trembling as I tried to describe what was happening. All I could manage was, "Someone's in the house. Please, hurry." The footsteps approached my room. Then, everything went silent. The silence was even more terrifying than the noise. I put my phone on silent and waited, my heart pounding in my chest. Time seemed to stretch on forever. I heard the floorboards creak slowly, as if someone were standing just outside my door, listening. When the police finally arrived, the house was empty. They said there were no signs of forced entry, but I knew what I had heard. On the floor of the hallway, they found a strange object, another old toy, this time a doll missing one eye, with a note attached to its dress. It read, "Welcome to the neighborhood." After that night, I couldn't stay there any longer. I moved in with my sister while I searched for a new place to live, but the feeling of being watched never went away. To this day, I still wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I hear footsteps outside my window. Even surrounded by people, I feel alone, as if something or someone is still out there waiting for me. Maybe it's just paranoia. Or maybe he's waiting for me somewhere else, ready to continue the nightmare. When I arrived in the neighborhood, the first thing that caught my attention was the silence. Not the peaceful kind that comforts you, but the kind that presses down on you, like the air was trapped in people's lungs. The house was modest, with peeling paint and a roof that needed repairs, but perfect for starting over. As a single mother, the low rent was an unexpected blessing. Lucas, my 6-year-old son, was excited about the idea of having his own room. As we unloaded the boxes, I noticed the neighborhood. All the houses were identical, but lifeless, as if frozen in time. The only exception was the house next door. Its windows were covered with thick curtains, even during the day, and the garden looked abandoned, with weeds growing wildly. As I carried a box of books, I felt a pair of eyes on me. When I looked, I saw a curtain move quickly in the house next door. That night, after putting Lucas to bed, I heard something strange. A low, dragged sound, like wood scraping against concrete. It seemed to come from the backyard. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, and I checked the doors and windows before going to sleep. But the sound lingered in my mind, echoing in the back of my head. The following days passed slowly and uneasily. Lucas seemed happy at his new school, but at home, things started to change. He asked me about the man in the window. When I asked what he meant, he pointed to the house next door. "He's always there, Mom. Always watching us. He doesn't smile. He doesn't move." My stomach churned. I tried to laugh it off, telling him he must have imagined it, but my laugh sounded forced, even to me. One afternoon, while I was cleaning the yard, I found something strange near the fence. An old toy car, the paint chipped, and the wheels crooked. It wasn't Lucas's. When I looked toward the house next door, the door was slightly ajar. I had never seen anyone enter or leave that house, and something about the darkness beyond the door seemed to be watching me back. That night, the dragged sound came again, louder and closer. I walked to the living room window and peered out. At first I saw nothing. But then, A tall shadow moved between the trees in the backyard. I grabbed my phone and called the police. They came, inspected the area, and said there was no sign of an intruder. Probably an animal, they said. That same night, Lucas had a nightmare. He woke up screaming, saying someone was in the hallway. When I rushed to check, the house was empty. The next morning, while I was tidying up his bed, I found a crumpled piece of paper under his pillow. It was a drawing. A tall, thin figure with enormous, disproportionate eyes was drawn in the center. Beside it was a blue square, clearly representing a window. "It's the man who watches me, Mom." That night, I slept in Lucas's room. The following days were marked by a growing sense of unease. Every night felt longer, as if something in the dark was waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Lucas began to speak less, as though he was carrying a secret too heavy for his age. On the night when everything changed, I woke up to a distinct sound, the creaking of a door. My heart raced, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But then, I heard light footsteps in the hallway, followed by the muffled sound of a laugh that wasn't human. It was low, raspy, and seemed to come from a place that didn't make sense. I jumped out of bed and ran to Lucas's room. He wasn't there. The window was open, gently swaying with the wind. My vision blurred as I rushed through the house, calling his name. I found the back door wide open, swaying lightly with the breeze. The air outside was thick with a damp, moldy smell that made my stomach turn. In the backyard, under the faint light of the moon, I saw Lucas. He was standing by the fence, motionless, staring into the house next door. His hands hung limply at his sides, and his eyes were locked on the darkness beyond the slightly ajar door. "Lucas," I called, but he didn't respond. My legs trembled as I moved closer. When I reached him, I grabbed his arm, but he seemed stuck in some sort of trance. "He's calling me, Mom," he said, in a voice that wasn't his. I looked toward the house next door, and my blood ran cold. In the dark of the open door, there was a figure, tall, thin, with pale skin like wax. Its eyes, disproportionately large, glowed in a way that wasn't natural. And that smile, it wasn't a human smile. It stretched too wide, from one corner of its face to the other. The figure took a step forward. Even without making a sound, I felt the ground beneath my feet vibrate. With every ounce of strength I had, I pulled Lucas and ran back to the house. I slammed the door shut and pushed a dresser in front of it, while Lucas began to cry. I called the police again, trying to explain what had happened. When they arrived, the house next door was completely empty. No furniture, no signs that anyone had ever lived there. But in Lucas's room, they found something that made the officers exchange uneasy glances. On the bed was the toy car I had found in the yard days earlier. But now, it was clean, as if it had just been used. That night, we didn't sleep. The next day, I packed up our things and left the house for good. Time passed, but the trauma stayed. Lucas still wakes up screaming, saying, "The man in the window is watching him." He refuses to sleep near windows or doors, and I don't blame him. As for me, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Whether I am at home, at work, or even in the grocery store, I feel the weight of that gaze. No matter where I go, I am sure he's still there. The other day, while driving down the old street, I couldn't resist the curiosity. I stopped in front of the house next door. It looked just as abandoned as before, but something was different. The door was ajar. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and share it with friends who love a good scare. Also, let me know in the comments which story gave you the most chills. I can't wait to hear from you.